In this study, we tried to put together this value of the trade in a very conservative way because we don't want to overstate the contribution of the trade, but because a number of the variables are quite uncertain, we tried to be pretty conservative going forward. So of a total number of cattle around that are exported, on average is around 725,000, just over 500,000 of those additional cattle, from the northern zone, particularly from Northern Territory around in Western Australia, would need transporting to processing. So that'd be either east to Queensland, to the main slaughter area over there, or south to Perth from northwest Western Australia. As part of the study, we determined that under current market conditions, sufficient capacity would have existed on the eastern seaboard, particularly to slaughter those cattle. So therefore, the additional cost faced by producers in this region would be transporting those cattle east to Queensland or south to Perth. And this value would be significant, around $80 million, or between 40 and 45 cents per kilo live weight basis. So that's pretty significant. The scenario for sheep in Western Australia is a little bit more complex because of the dynamics between how many sheep there are exported relative to slaughter capacity in Western Australia and the transport costs east for those sheep need to be moved east for slaughter. So over the average of the last 4 years, about 3 million sheep on average came from Western Australia, and this lines up against about 5 million sheep slaughtered each year in WA. So without the trade, there's a potential to increase the demands on slaughter capacity in WA by around 60%. And as part of this process, we looked at the slaughter capacity in WA and determined that there was the potential to kill another 1 million sheep, or a 20% increase, given current and potential supply capacity that could be brought on board if the trade were to close. So after putting this picture together, as part of this scenario without the trade, we estimated that around 2 million older sheep would need to be transported east for slaughter. And a key assumption here is that all the younger lamb types would be slaughtered within WA. And an interesting dimension to the trade is because of the shortage of sheep, the percentage of younger sheep going on boats now is much higher than it has been historically. And this is an important driver of the results. So how did we put all this picture of a diversion and transport cost together? Well, we used the MLA's GMI, or Global Meat Industries model. It's quite a detailed model of meat markets, livestock. It identifies all our key markets, meat and live export markets, and it recognises some critical interactions between those markets. And it also includes, of course, not only Indonesia as a critical market for live feeder cattle, but also the Middle East as the market for live sheep. And the value of this impact was estimated by simply shutting down exports or diverting those exports through the processing sector and recognising the additional transport and feeding costs required to access those markets. So without the trade, and these are national numbers, sale yard prices would be significantly lower. So, in terms of grass-fed cattle, they'd be 4% or about, on average, nearly 8 cents per kilo lower. But the impact on lambs and for older sheep especially is far more significant, up to 14, nearly 15 cents per kilo live weight for older sheep. One of the key drivers of the older sheep result is that part of the scenario where we have to pay some additional transport costs to actually put those sheep on a truck and send them east for slaughter. Of course, the impacts on the regions will be much greater, because not only do they get the lower national price, but they'd also have to pay the additional transport costs as well. So in summary, across basically what we think at a national basis the trade actually adds to each of the key outputs is actually quite significant. For mutton, on average, the price could be 20% lower than what it would otherwise be. For grass-fed cattle, it's 4%, but given that this applies to the entire turn-off, when you multiply that through, you get quite a significant GVP result. As a result of that diversion, processing, of course, the amount of livestock going through processing increases production of processing, and most of this increased processed product would end up in our key price-sensitive markets, and that's because more supply reduces the price, and that end up in the key destinations that we identified this morning. An important issue I'll come back to here is the crossover between those markets that demand live animals and how they'd substitute towards box product in absence of the trade. Without the live trade, GVP would be $176 million lower for sheep, $119 million for lamb. That's a national GVP. And when you translate this back to farm income, that's roughly across the red meat sector, you'd have incomes, farm incomes and incomes up the chain would be around about $126 million lower. For live dairy and heifers, there's also a significant contribution in proportion to the total export amount. And it's good to emphasise that this is a fairly conservative approach with the amount. Across all live exports, the contribution in each year was about $248 million, but particularly we have to say that these would impact on northern beef and the WA sheep industry. Over time, because this is an update, we compare where we would, how the study lines up to the previous study. These results are lower. Two main factors: we've been more conservative with our assumptions, especially around transport costs, and the significantly higher underlying sheep price. As we saw this morning, strong demand for lamb has certainly reduced somewhat the impact of the trade. Just quickly and wrapping up, key drivers of the results. As I said, a key assumption was the limited substitution between essentially live cattle and box product, live cattle and sheep and box product in each of the markets. Key drivers is cultural practice, lack of a refrigeration chain, but we acknowledge that these factors are changing slowly. Another key factor is the supply response of producers to lower prices and higher transport costs. This is an area that's been driven that's been debated widely recently, and it all hinges on your assumptions about the scope for these producers to move out of internal to alternative enterprises. I think this is a critical issue, especially in the northern beef sector, because a lot of the productivity improvements and corporatisation within the north has actually been driven by the live trade, and it doesn't seem to me that there's many options apart from going back to a harvest-based system as compared to a managed cow-calf system as it is now. In terms of sheep, some previous studies have said declining flock numbers, as we've seen, is a rationale for reduced value of the trade. I think it works the other way. I agree with the forecast this morning. I think sheep numbers will stabilise and increase as farmers will look to diversify away from grains. So the bottom line on the contribution, the trade will continue, has made and continue to make a significant contribution, but it will depend on continual access to key markets and also the relative performance of the processing chain. I think I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.